As with many of you, we've enjoyed the summer, right? It's a little bit of free time. It's restful. So one of the things I was able to do with a little bit of spare time was watch the movie Rocky, the boxing movie, at the suggestion of a friend of mine. And so I'd never watched it before, even though it was released the year I was born, so that's 38 years ago. But it was still a very, very fine film. I didn't watch it because there are so many versions of Rocky. I think there's 6 now. Anyway, so I watched it. It was very, very satisfying. And so I read an article about Sylvester Stallone when he released his 6th version entitled Rocky Balboa. And it's very insightful about what inspired him to not only to act in those movies, but he was the writer, he was essentially the producer, director, and everything for these movies. And he said the inspiration for the Rocky series was his Christian faith. He said his Christian faith inspired him to produce his first Rocky movie, and when he reverted to his Catholic faith, it inspired him to produce the 6th one, Rocky Balboa. So in this interview, he had said that, like, as with most of us, he was raised in a Christian home, a Catholic school, did everything one was supposed to until one got into the real world, and then said, okay, now I'm free of all the entrapments of the Christian faith. Now I can really be on my own. And he did pretty well for himself in terms of Hollywood success. But ultimately, he found his life unsatisfying. By putting his faith and fame and career ahead of his own family and his Christian faith, he found it did not satisfy him. And so he made a point of going back to church. In fact, in this interview from the website citizenlink.com, is that he said, the more I went to church, the more I began to believe and be inspired by his word, and the more I could be guided by God. Imagine a Hollywood movie star saying that his faith inspired him and in fact has transformed him to produce even Rocky Balboa. So Sylvester Stallone realized, hey, that it was faith that truly satisfied him and transformed him to produce these really great movies. And likewise for us, the rock of faith truly satisfies us and transforms us. So the theme of faith has permeated our Gospels of the past few Sundays. Last week's Gospel, we encountered the Canaanite woman who goes to Jesus and pleads and screams that her daughter would be saved by what Jesus would do to cure her daughter of this demonic possession. But Jesus says to her, I've come for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, the Jewish people. He didn't come, at least in Matthew's Gospel, to come for the Gentiles within Palestine. But this woman pleads and begs, and so finally he says to her, great is your faith, your daughter is healed, and she's healed. So this week's Gospel, Jesus asks his disciples about faith. And I think to really appreciate where Jesus comes from, I think it's always good to read the Gospel for the coming study in advance, and not only that, but to open up one's Gospels and to see what the text is, and what is before it and what's after it. So what happens before Jesus takes his disciples up to Caesarea Philippi? He meets with the leaders of the lost sheep of the house of Israel, the Sadducees and Pharisees. And they've heard about him, and they say to him, we want a sign from heaven that you are truly a great leader. And Jesus realizes their lack of faith. He says, you will get one sign. It'll be the sign of Jonah. That Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so too will the Son of Man be in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights. So the leaders of the lost sheep of the house of Israel don't believe in Jesus. So Jesus takes his disciples up, as I mentioned, to Caesarea Philippi, and he asks them about faith. Now I would say, as I mentioned about the importance of context when it comes to reading Scripture, and especially our Gospels, even the context is significant for where Jesus asks his disciples about faith. He could have asked them in Capernaum, the center of his public ministry. He could have asked them this question in Bethlehem, where he was born, or also in Nazareth, where he had grown up. But he goes specifically to Caesarea Philippi. Why? Well, for one thing, it's a very mountainous region. And second of all, more importantly, it is probably the most religious place in Palestine, in the Holy Land, and now subsequent. But at the time of Jesus, that was very significant. Why? Well, it's very religious because there were a number of temples around Caesarea Philippi. that the Syrian god Baal had 14 temples in that area. And the Baal believers had a great struggle with the Israelite believers. And so there are always these clashes, especially from Elijah, who Jesus referred to in the Gospels, who has to fight the priests of Baal. So a lot of temples to the Greek, or to the Syrian god Baal. Also, for those who follow the Greek gods, the god Pan was supposed to have been born in one of the caverns around Caesarea Philippi. And Pan is the god of nature for the Greek pagans. Also significant is that Caesarea Philippi comes from for Jesus' time, very recent. Caesarea Philippi, Caesar and Philip. Well, where does Philip come from? Philip was the son of King Herod, and so the area was named after his son. And King Herod, to get political influence from the Romans, built a temple in honor of Caesar. The Roman people believed that Caesar was a god himself, and so King Herod builds a temple for Caesar in Caesarea Philippi. For the Jewish people, it's also significant for Caesarea Philippi because it is the source of the river Jordan, not only to physically refresh the people of Palestine, but also it has spiritual significance. It is the place where the Jewish people crossed in from their wandering for 40 years in the desert into the promised land. And that's where Jesus himself baptized the river Jordan. So the whole area is very, very faith-filled. And so it's very appropriate that Jesus would take his disciples to ask him about faith. And so he asks him, who do people say that I am? A prophet? John the Baptist? Who? And then Jesus specifically asks them, who do you say that I am? And it's Peter who comes forward and says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus applauds Peter's faith. The flesh and blood never revealed this, that the human reasoning can't reveal this, because Jesus is that itinerant preacher. He's poor, he's a carpenter. And for Peter to see beyond sight, to see that this guy is really the real deal. And so Jesus applauds him. And so Peter is truly satisfied by this acceptance of faith. So faith is a gift from God to believe in him, even though maybe it doesn't seem rational at the moment. And also for Peter to be humble enough to accept it, to follow this Christ, the one who's to bring salvation to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And because Peter's faith is acknowledged by Jesus, two things happen to Peter. One, his name changes, and number two, he is given a responsibility. His name changes from Simon to now Peter. Peter means rock in Greek, and it's in a mountainous area, in a faith-filled environment. So because Peter's faith is such that he truly acknowledges that Jesus is the Son of God, his name changes. And it happens from Abraham to St. Paul. So anyone who has a big responsibility, their name changes. And also for Peter, that he is given a massive responsibility. That Peter will now have the church built upon his faith, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And whatever he looses on earth, will be loosed in heaven, and whatever he binds on earth, will be bound in heaven. So it's a great responsibility of managing and administering the spiritual needs of the church. And so this is the task of Peter. So Peter finds his faith is satisfied in Jesus and also becomes transformative. And so likewise with us, the rock of faith transforms us and satisfies us. Now what about us? Are we also satisfied in our faith and also transformed by it? I would say yes. The very fact that we're here is a sign we want God. We want our faith nourished. And it's also transformative. It began in baptism. And our parents, or even some of us as adults, accepted the faith ourselves and are transformed by that. And therefore, we are given a great task to bring this good news to others. At the same time, it is not easy. And I know many people struggle with faith when they're sick, when they're perplexed by the anxieties of life, or when life does not make sense. And that's why it's so important that in the commandments that we're to take the Sabbath holy, because the Sabbath is a moment of rest. We come together as the church, the body of Christ, those who accepted faith in God and taken it for themselves to be transformed, to nourish one another as examples of faith. That That some of us are strong, some of us are weak, some of us are perplexed, some of us are very confident, some of us are brand new to the church or brand new to Chestermere, some of us have been here a long time. And so we need one another's witness to be encouraged in faith, especially when it doesn't make sense. So as I mentioned earlier about the context in the Gospels, we know what happens before Jesus encounters the Sadducees and Pharisees. What happens after? Well, it's when Jesus says that he will have to die. And Peter says, no, it can't happen. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. I think not only is Peter's example, his faith, the essence of the foundation of the church, but also his example. In John chapter 6, when Jesus says, I'm the bread of life, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you, the Jewish people said, that's cannibalism. We're not going to do that. And so a lot of the followers of Jesus left him. And Jesus asks Peter, well, will you also leave? Peter says, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of everlasting life. So Peter's example in following the Lord, but it's also the challenges of faith. And we know that Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And that Jesus in John chapter 21 asked him 3 times to undo the 3 denials. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And Jesus would say to him, when you were younger, you could do what you want. But when you're older, someone will tie a rope around your waist and take you where you do not want to go. And ultimately, Jesus says to him, follow me. And so the life of faith is not only the initial acceptance, but is that ongoing following. And that's why we're here. To be nourished in our faith, in our own example, as we look to the example of St. Peter, but ultimately in what God does for us. He gives us his word to inspire us. He gives us his word, his body, blood to nourish us. To then bring this good news to people everywhere. Because it is faith that truly satisfies and transforms us. And so for those who may be interested in watching Rocky again, to always remember Sylvester Stallone, even though he's a big movie star, really found satisfaction in his life when he came back to the faith. And he tells a story, saying he left the faith, but then he realized, hey, it's the faith that really transforms me. And so Rocky Balboa is a perfect example of what happens to people who come back to the faith. And many of us in our lives have probably kind of wandered or as I mentioned earlier, struggling with faith, but hey, that's okay. The Lord just welcomes us back, transforms us, and then bring that good news to people everywhere. And so this week, there'll be many opportunities in which we'll encounter people who stray from the faith or even antagonistic to the faith. You have to say, hey, the Lord loves you, and it's truly through our witness and even what we say, let it be examples for others that their faith, in turn through us, may be nourished and satisfied and transformed through faith in Jesus.